slaves of machinery. To multitudes of men and women the lure of levers, cranks, wheels, and pinions is as seductive, as insidious, as heavenly in its promises, and as hellish in its performances, as the opium habit. The craving for opium, however, is an acquired taste, while the passion for machinery is born in thousands. We have seen children, while yet in their baby cabs, fascinated by automobiles, sewing machines, and even little mechanical toys. We knew a boy on a farm who built a fairly workable miniature threshing machine with his own hands before he was old enough to speak the name of it in anything but baby talk. We have seen boys work in the broiling sun day after day hoeing potatoes, pulling weeds, gathering crops, and doing other hard jobs for small pay, carefully saving every penny to buy a toy steam engine. Parents usually look upon these evidences of mechanical ability with pleasure. They regard them as sure indications of the vocation of the child, and oftentimes do everything in their power to encourage him in these lines. They little realize, however, the supreme danger which attaches to this very manifestation. Nor have they looked far enough ahead to see what is, in so many cases, the lamentable result. The restless, machine-crazy boy. The boy of this type hates to sit quietly on a hard bench in a school and study books. Some of the boys who went to school with us had imitation levers and valve handles fastened about their desks in an ingenious way, and instead of studying, pretended that they were locomotive engineers. With a careful eye upon the teacher, who was his semaphore, such a boy would work the reverse lever, open and close the throttle, apply and disengage the brakes, test the lubrication, and otherwise go through the motions of running a locomotive with great seriousness and huge enjoyment. These boys usually have considerable trouble with their teachers. They do not like grammar, frequently do not care for geography and history. They flounder dolefully in these studies, and are in a state of more or less continual rebellion and disgrace. Because of their intense activity and restlessness, they irritate the teacher. She wants quiet in the schoolroom. Their surreptitious playing, rapping and tapping on desks, and other evidences of dammed-up energy and desire for more freedom and more scope of action, interferes with the desired sanctity of silence. Outside of school hours, and during the long vacation, the fatal fascination of machinery draws these young people to factories, railroad yards, machine shops, and other places where they may indulge their fancy and craving for mechanical motion. The boy who hangs around a machine shop or railroad yard is always pressed into voluntary and delighted service by those who work there. In a small town in Wisconsin, we once knew a boy who worked willingly, and at the hardest kind of labor in a railroad yard for years, voluntarily and without a cent of pay. In time, he was entrusted with a small responsibility and given a small salary. Even if the boy does not begin in this way, the result is substantially the same. He may take the bit in his teeth, leave school, and go to work at some trade which will give at least temporary satisfaction for his mechanical craving, or he may, through economic necessity, be forced out of school and naturally gravitate into a machine shop or factory. Oftentimes a few dollars a week is a very welcome addition to the family income. To the boy himself, $3, $4, $5, or $6 a week seems like a fortune. Neither the parents nor the boy look ahead. Neither of them sees that when the little salary has increased to $15, $16, $18, or $25 a week, the boy will have reached the zenith of his possibilities. There will then be no further advancement, unless, during his apprenticeship and journeymanship, or previously to them, he has secured mental training which will enable him to go higher, hold more responsible positions, and earn larger pay. Man or machine, which? In former days, the boy who left school and took up employment in a factory learned a trade. He became a shoemaker, or a harness maker, or a wheelwright, or a gun maker. Today, however, the work on all of these articles has been so subdivided that the boy perhaps becomes stranded in front of a machine which does nothing but punch out the covers for tin cans, or cut pieces of leather for the heels of shoes, or some other finer operation in manufacture. Once he has mastered the comparatively simple method of operating his particular machine, the boy is likely to remain there for all time. His employer, perhaps short-sighted, has no desire to advance him, because this would mean breaking in another boy to handle his machine. Also, it would mean paying more money. Al Priddy, in his illuminating book, Man or Machine, Which?, thus describes the case of the slave to the machine. The Pilgrim Press, Boston. The working man has been taught that his chief asset is skill. It has been his stocks, his bonds, the pride of his life. Poor as to purse and impoverished in his household, his cupboard bare, his last penny spent on a bread crust, he is not humbled. No, he merely stretches out his 10 fingers and 2 callous palms, exactly as a proud king extends his diamond-tipped scepter, to show you that which upholds him in his birthright. My skill is my portion given to the world, he says. I shall not want. See, I am without a penny. I touch this bar of steel, and it becomes a scissors blade. My skill did it. I take this stick of oak, and it becomes a chair rung. My skill is the grandest magic on earth, the common magic of every day. By it I live, and because of it I hold my head royal high. But the machine now attacks and displaces this skill. The cunning of trained fingers is transferred to cranks, cogs, and belts. The trade secrets are objectified in mechanical form, able to mix the product, compound the chemicals, or make the notch at the right place. Besides this loss of skill, the workman loses, in the grind of the machine, his sense of the value of his work. Next to his pride of skill, the workman has always been proud to be the connoisseur. Stand back near the light with his product on his upraised hand, showing to all passers-by what he has done. Perhaps it was a red morocco slipper for a dancer, or a pearl button to go on the cloak of a little child, or maybe it was a horseshoe to go on the mayor's carriage horse. On a day, a party of visitors would come to the little shop, and the owner would pick up a hand-forged hammer and say, "See what John made." But in our modern industry, no one man ever completes a task. Each task is subdivided into 20, 40, 100 or more portions, and a working man is given just one to work on, day by day, year after year, for a working generation. After the time has come when the workman can find no distinct aesthetic pleasure in his work, his loyalty to his employer suffers a shock. Then, when this indifference or disloyalty is full grown, the employer has full on him acute and formidable labor diseases. The man who should stand at his shoulder faces him, instead, with a hostile poise. The mill full of people over whom he holds power, upon whom he depends for his success, and who, in turn, depend upon his initiative and capital for their bread and butter, is turned into an armed camp of plotting enemies who, while they work, grumble, and who, while they receive their wages, scheme for the overthrow of the entire concern. His mills, instead of being shelters for his brothers and sisters, are nests of scratching eagles, ready to rend and claw. It is further given out that the machine robs man of his industrial initiative, that the complicated and specialized machine decreases his mental alertness. In addition to his skill and his appreciation of his product, the workman has ever prized the appeal his labor has made to his individual intelligence. His work has brought thinking power with it. His day's task has included the excitement of invention and adventure. In the heat and burden of the week has come that thrilling moment when his mind has discovered the fact that a variation in method means a simplification of his task. Or, in the monotonous ongoing of his labor, He has suddenly realized that by sheer brain power, he has accomplished a third more work than his neighbor. He has counted such results compliments to his initiative, to his thinking power. They have brought a reward 3 times more satisfying than a mere increase in wage, for, in his eyes, they have been substantial testimonies to the freedom of his mind, something which every reasonable person puts higher than any king's ransom. But the coming of the machine deadens the workman's inclination toward inventive adventure. So the multitude of men and women stand before the cunning machinery of industry in the pose of helplessness before a mechanical finality. They cannot help feeling that in so far as their special task is involved, the machine has said the last word. The challenge dies out of their work. The brain that has ever been on the quiver of adventurous expectancy relaxes its tension, and the workman moodily or indifferently lets his machine do its perfect work, while his undisciplined, unchallenged thoughts wander freely over external, social, or domestic concerns. It may give an indolent, unambitious, selfish type of employee a certain amount of satisfaction to know that the machine frees his mind of initiative, but to the considerate workman it is a day of tragedy when his brain power receives no challenge from his work, and that day has dawned in the minds of millions of men who throng our industries. So then, when this machine robber, without heart or conscience, makes of little repute the workman's most shining glory, skill, steals rudely from him the aesthetic pleasure in his product, and leaves him mentally crippled before his work, how little force has that honored appeal, the dignity of labor. Talk as we will, in this machine-ridden time, the dignity of labor is but a skeleton of its former robust self. Take away the king's throne, the courtier's carpet, the royal prerogative, and then speak about the divine right. All the dignity of labor can mean in these days is simply that it is more dignified for a man to earn a wage than it is to be a doorway loafer. The workingman's throne, skill, has gone. His prerogative, skill, has been taken away. The items that have formerly given dignity to labor have been largely displaced, so far as we have adventured, by the machine, and the future holds out no other hope than this, that machine shall more and more increase. There is little dignity in a task that a man does which may be equally well done by his 14-year-old boy or girl. There is little dignity in a task which less and less depends upon independent knowledge. But must these workers remain always slaves of machine? Is there no escape for them? Is there no underground railroad by which they may win their way to freedom? Here is what Alpriti has to say about it. The most convincing way in which man may master the machine is when he invents a new and better one, or improves an old one. This is the real triumph of mind over matter, of skill over machinery. With all its arrogance among us, machinery is always final in itself, incapable of change, incapable of progression or retrogression. Till the clouds fade from the sky, or the earth cracks, a machine will remain the same from the day of its creation until the day of its last whirl, unless man says the word to change it. Once started on its mission, there is nothing in the world can change the motion and purpose of a machine save man's mind. So then, whatever relation man might have toward a machine, this stands sure, he will ever be able to stand before it and say, I am thy master. I can change thee, make thee better or worse. I made thee. I can unmake thee. If thou dost accomplish such mighty works, more honor to the mind which conceived thee. But it is suddenly discovered by an industrial diagnosis that the machine has never been properly operated, even by the most skilled operators. It has been proved that there is more science in the most unskilled task than the man who performs it is capable of understanding. This dictum of Mr. Taylor, a practical experimenter, has been dramatically proved in many directions. In the task of the sand shoveler, or the iron lifter, for instance, it was proved that by scientifically undertaking such work, 50 selected men, properly drilled, scientifically rested, intelligently maneuvered, could accomplish a third more than 100 ill-selected and improperly managed men in less time and under a larger salary. It is suddenly found that, contrary to theory, a machine, to be economically operated, leaves open man's chance for skill and does not rob him of it. Perhaps a few cases taken from our records will indicate how men of this kind are able to come up from slavery and take successful places in their true vocations. From boiler room to chief engineer's office. G manifested very early indications of the lure of machinery for him. While yet in his cradle, he would play contentedly for hours with a little pulley or other mechanical trifle. Before he was able to walk, he could drive nails with a hammer sturdily, and with more precision than many adults. This also was one of his favorite amusements, and it was necessary to keep him provided with lumber, lest he fill the furniture with nails. As he grew older, he became more and more interested in machinery and mechanical things. He took to pieces the family clock and put it together again. He nearly always had the sewing machine partly dismantled, but could always put it together again, and it usually ran better after he had finished his work. He built water wheels, windmills, and other mechanical toys. When he was about 14 years old, he built a steam engine. He used a bicycle pump for the cylinder and pieces of an old sewing machine, a discarded wringer, some brass wires, and other odds and ends for the rest of the parts. So perfect mechanically was this product that when steam was turned on it ran smoothly, and with very little noise, at the rate of 3,000 revolutions a minute. In this engine he employed a form of valve motion which he had never seen, and which had never been used before. While not particularly efficient, and therefore not a valuable invention, it at least showed his ability to adapt means to ends mechanically. After G began earning money for himself by mechanical and electrical work, he would go without luxuries, food and clothing, tramping to the shop almost barefoot one entire winter, for the sake of buying tools and equipment to carry on his mechanical experiments. It is not surprising, therefore, that he left school at an early age to engage in actual work in railroad shops. He afterwards secured a position as a locomotive fireman. Circumstances arose which made it necessary for him to give up railroading. He secured a position as fireman on a stationary engine. A hard fight for an education. It was while he was engaged in this kind of work that the suggestion was made to him that he ought not to try to go through life with only the rudiments of an education. It was pointed out that, while he had undoubted mechanical and inventive ability, he would have small opportunity to use it unless he also had the necessary technical and scientific knowledge to go with it. At first his interest in mechanics was so intense, and his interest in school in general so comparatively slight, that he did not look with very much favor upon the suggestion. However, as time went on, and he saw more and more of the results of such action as he was contemplating, he became more and more interested in completing his education. He therefore entered a good preparatory school and, with some little assistance from relatives, worked his way through by doing electrical and mechanical work about the little college town. In this kind of work, he soon became well known and was in constant requisition. Occasionally his ingenuity and resourcefulness enabled him to do successfully work which had puzzled and baffled even those who were called experts. Having finished his preparatory course, he began a course in mechanical and electrical engineering in one of the best known of our universities. About this time practically all assistance from relatives had been withdrawn, owing to changed circumstances, and he was left almost entirely dependent upon his own efforts. The story of his struggles would fill a volume. Oftentimes, he was almost entirely without food. There was 1 month during which he was unable to collect money due him for work done. Because he was a poor university student, he had no credit. So he lived the entire month on $1.25. He thus explains how it was done. Living a month on $1.25. After visiting all of my clients trying to collect money, I came to the conclusion that it would be useless to expect anything to come into me for at least 30 days. At this time, I had $1.25 in my pocket. My room I had paid for in advance by doing a piece of work for my landlord. I also had about a cord of good oak wood which I had sawed and split and piled in the hallway under the stairs. I had a little sheet iron stove which I used for both heating and cooking. I sat down and carefully figured out how I could make my $1.25 feed me until I could collect the money due. 25 cents purchased 3 quarts of strained honey from a beekeeper friend of mine. The $1 I invested in hominy. Every morning, when I first got up and built the fire, I put on a double boiler with as much hominy as would cook in it. While it was cooking, I sat down and studied hard on my calculus. By the time I had got a pretty good hold of the pot hooks and the bird tracks in the calculus lesson, the hominy would be ready to eat. Hominy and honey is not a bad breakfast. While perhaps you would like some variety, it is also fairly edible for lunch. If you are very, very hungry, as a growing boy ought to be, and have been hard at work putting up bell wires and arranging batteries, doubtless you would rather eat hominy and honey for dinner than go without. The next morning the combination doesn't taste quite so good, and by lunchtime you are beginning to wonder whether hominy and honey will satisfy all your cravings. In the evening, however, you are quite sure that, in the absence of anything else, you will have to have some hominy and honey in order to keep yourself alive. By the end of the first week you feel that you can never even hear the word hominy again without nausea, and that you wish never to look a bee in the face. By the end of the second week you have become indifferent to the whole matter, and simply take your hominy and honey as a matter of course, trying to think nothing about it, and interesting yourself as much as possible in calculus, generator design, strength of materials, and other things that an engineering student has to study. The month finally passed. I felt as if I had eaten my way out of a mountain of hominy, and waded through a sea of honey. Collections began coming in a little, and I went and bought a beefsteak. You may have eaten some palatable viands. I have myself partaken of meals that cost as much as I made in a whole week's work in my school days. But let me assure you that no one ever had a meal that tasted better than the beefsteak and fried potatoes, which finally broke the hominy and honey regime. After this, our young friend hired a little larger room, laid in a few cheap dishes and cooking utensils, and took 2 or 3 of his fellow students to board. He did the marketing and the cooking and made them help him wash the dishes. 2 were engineering students, and the third was a student in the College of Agriculture, all working their way through college. A few cents saved was a memorable event in their lives. Our young engineer furnished table board at $1.25 a week, and out of the $3.75 a week paid him by his boarders was able to buy all of his own food as well as theirs, and pay his room rent. The hard fight justified. After many troubles of this kind, G. finished his engineering course and secured a position in one of the largest corporations in the United States at a salary of $50 a month. At the time when he went to work for the big corporation, there were probably 300 or 400 other graduate engineers added to the staff. So keen was his mind along mechanical and engineering lines, and so great were his natural aptitudes, that within a few months his wages had been increased to $60 a month, and he had been given far more responsible work. Almost as soon as he took up work with the corporation, he began making improvements in methods, inventing machinery and other devices, and thinking out ways and means for saving labor and making shortcuts. Within a few weeks after his joining the force, he had invented a bit of apparatus which could be carried in the coat pocket and which took the place of a clumsy contrivance which required a horse and wagon to carry it. In this way he saved the company the price of horses, wagons, drivers, etc., on a great many operations. From the very first, the young man rose very much more rapidly than any of the others who had entered the employ of the company at the time he did. Soon he was occupying an executive position and directing the activities of scores of men. Today, only 9 years after his leaving school, he occupies one of the most important positions in the engineering department of this great corporation, and while he does not have the title, performs nearly all the duties of chief engineer. The point of all this story is that this young man, while he had plenty of mechanical ability and enjoyed machinery, was not fit to be a locomotive fireman or stationary engine fireman. He had, in addition to his mechanical sense and great skill in the use of his hands, a very keen, wide-awake, energetic, ambitious, accurate intellectual equipment which did not find any adequate use in his work as a mechanic or fireman. Nor could he ever have found expression for it unless he had taken the initiative as a result of wise counsel and secured for himself the necessary education and training. With all his ingenuity, he would always have been more or less a slave to the machine to be operated unless he had trained his mind to make him the master of thousands of machines and of men. From turret lathe to treasury. About 8 years ago, while we were in St. Paul, Minnesota, a young mechanic, J.F., came to us for consultation. He was about 20 years old and expressed himself as being dissatisfied with his work. "I don't know just what is the matter with me," he said. "I have loved to play with mechanical things. I was always building machinery and, when I had an opportunity, hanging around machine shops and watching the men work. On account of these things, my father was very sure that I had mechanical ability, and when I was 15 years old took me out of school and apprenticed me in a machine shop. This shop was partly devoted to the manufacture of heavy machinery and partly to repairs of all kinds of machinery and tools. I have now been at work in this shop for 5 years. I am a journeyman mechanic and making good wages, and yet, somehow or other, I feel that I am in the wrong place. I wish you could tell me what is the matter with me." After examining the young man and the data submitted, we made the following report. Analysis of an embryo financier. While you have undoubted mechanical ability, this is a minor part of your intellectual equipment. You are also qualified for commercial pursuits. You have a good sense of values. You understand the value of $1 even now, and you have natural aptitudes which, with proper training and experience, will make you an excellent financier. You also have executive ability. You like people, and you like to deal with them. You like to handle them, and because you enjoy handling people and negotiating with them, you are successful in doing so. While you are fairly active physically, you are very much more active mentally. Your work, therefore, should be mental work, with a fair amount of light physical activity mingled with it, instead of purely physical work. You ought to hold an executive position, and ought to have charge of the finances of some concern which is engaged in the building and selling of machinery. You have worked, up to the present time, with heavy, coarse, crude machinery. But you are a fine texture, refined type, and naturally have a desire to work with that which is fine, delicate, and beautiful, something into which you can put some of your natural refinement and artistic ability. You are still young. You have learned a trade at which you can earn fairly good wages. You ought, therefore, to prepare yourself in some way for business. Work during the summer, and then during the winter resume your studies, preparing yourself for an executive position in connection with manufacturing and selling fine machinery. Study accounting, banking, finance, salesmanship, advertising, mechanical engineering, and designing. At the earliest possible moment, give up your work in a machine shop where heavy machinery is manufactured and begin to get some actual experience in the manufacture of something finer and more artistic. For example, the automobile. A few years later in Boston, a young man came to us, well-dressed, happy, and prosperous. He said he wished to consult us. After a few minutes' talk with him, we said, "We have given you advice somewhere before. This is not the first time you have consulted us." He smiled and said, "Yes, I consulted you in St. Paul some years ago. At that time you advised me to secure an executive position in the automobile business. This advice struck me at the time as being wise and satisfied my own desires and ambitions. I lost no time in following your directions, and was soon engaged as a mechanic in an automobile factory. I attended night school at first, but finally made arrangements to spend half my time in school and the other half in the factory, learning every part of the business. At the present time I am the vice president and treasurer of the motor company and one of the designers of the motor car. We are doing an excellent business and making money. Whereas I was certainly misfit in my old job, I am well and happily placed since I have learned my true vocation." Evolution of an electrical engineer. D.B. of Chicago was a young man admirably endowed with mechanical ability. From his earliest years, he was especially interested in matters electrical. His father told us that he always had dry cell and other batteries around the house. He used to try to make magnetos out of horseshoe magnets, and at one time attempted to build a dynamo. When he was 16 years of age, having finished grammar school and having had 1 or 2 years of high school training, young B. became so ambitious to get into electrical work that his father, thinking that he was intended for exactly this vocation, consented to his leaving high school and taking a position as assistant to the lineman of a telephone company. He worked at this a year or two, and finally became a full-fledged lineman. He did well as a lineman, and after a year or so attracted the attention of an electric light and power company, who enticed him away from the telephone company and gave him charge of poles and wires in a residential district. Here his unusual ingenuity and quickness soon became so manifest that he was taken off the outside and placed in charge of a gang of men wiring houses and installing electric fixtures. This was a pretty good job for a young fellow and paid good wages. At least, the wages seemed quite large to young B. at the time. By this time, however, he was 21 and decided to marry. He needed more money. Getting his bearings. He had a long talk with a very kind and wise adviser, who finally said to him, "See here, B, you have abilities that ought to be put to use at something better than stringing wires and hanging bells." "Why, I am a foreman now," said B. "Yes, I know you are a foreman, but who plans all the work you do?" "Why, the super." "Yes, the super hands the plans down to you, but who plans the work for him?" "Why, the chief." "Now, look here. The chief comes to his office at 10 o'clock in the morning. He uses his head until noon. He leaves at noon, and perhaps he doesn't come back until 2 or 3 o'clock. He uses his head then until 5 or sometimes until 4. Then he goes off to play golf. But as the result of those few hours' use of the chief's head, the superintendent, and you 6 or 8 foremen, and all the 200 men under your direction work a whole day or a week or even a month, as you know. You are merely carrying out in a mechanical, routine kind of a way the thoughts and ideas that another man thinks. Now, you have the ability to think for yourself. "I could think for myself," said he, "but I can't do all the figuring that is necessary in order to decide just what size wire should go here, and what kind of equipment should go there, and all the different things. That's beyond me." Yes, it is beyond you now, but it doesn't need to be beyond you. You have the mental ability to learn to use those formulae just as well as the chief does. The thing necessary is for you to learn how to do it, to get needful education. Now you are young and you're strong, and you've got lots of time before you. If you want to make more money, the way to do it is to learn to use your head and save weeks, months of time, as well as the labor of your hands. If I went off to college or university for 2 or 3 years, I don't think Bessie would wait for me," said he. "She wants to get married. I want to, too, and I think we ought to do it." An education by correspondence. "Well," said his counselor, "you don't need to go off to school. You can take electrical engineering in a correspondence course, even after you are married. You're making good wages now as a foreman. Your hours of work are only 8 a day, and you have plenty of time in the evenings and on holidays and other times to study this subject. Besides, you will probably make better progress studying it while you work at the trade than you would in school, and withdrawn from the practical applications of the principles that you are learning." The result of all this was that D.B. did take a correspondence course in electrical engineering. It was pretty tough work. He had not studied for years. One of the first things he had to learn was how to study, how to concentrate, how to learn the things he had to know without tremendous waste of energy. After a little while he learned how to study. Then he progressed, a little at a time, with the intricate and complicated mathematics of the profession he had determined to make his own. Again and again he was puzzled, perplexed, and almost defeated. But his young wife encouraged him, and when things got so bad that he thought he would have to give it all up, he would go and talk with his counselor, who would inspire him with new ambition, so that he would go to work again. So, month after month, year after year, he struggled away with his correspondence course in electrical engineering. Little by little, he got hold of the technical knowledge necessary for professional engineering work. A victory for the correspondence school graduate. At first, he was greatly handicapped by the prejudice of some of his superiors against correspondence school courses, which were very much newer at that time than they are now and regarded as much more of an experiment. His superiors were graduates of universities and looked down with contempt upon any merely practical man who tried to qualify as an engineer by studying at home at night and without the personal oversight of authorities in a university. But D.B. was dogged in his persistence. Missing no opportunities to improve and advance himself, he was, nevertheless, respectful and diplomatic, and he repeatedly demonstrated his grasp of the subject. Eventually he was promoted to the position of superintendent of the Electric Light and Power Company. There was only one man then between him and the desired goal, namely, the chief engineer. At the time B. became superintendent, the chief engineer was a young university graduate, and was perhaps a little too egotistical and dogmatic on account of his degree in honors. Soon after B. took charge as superintendent, the company decided to build a new central power station. The design was left to the young chief engineer, and the practical work of carrying it out to our friend. When, finally, the design was complete and passed on to D.B. for execution, he felt that it was defective in several ways. He spent several nights of hard study on it, and became convinced that he was right. He therefore took the whole matter to his superior, and tried to explain to him how the design was defective. "I made that plan, and it is right," said the chief engineer. "Your business isn't to criticize the plan, but to go ahead and carry it out. Now, I don't care to hear any more about it. But said B. If we carry out this plan the way it stands, it will mean the investment on the part of the company of something like $35,000, which will be practically dead loss. I can't conscientiously go to work and carry out this plan as it stands. I am sure if you will go over it again carefully, pay attention to my suggestions, and consult the proper authorities, you will find that I am right. That's what comes of studying a correspondence course, said the chief. You get a little smattering of knowledge into your head. Part of it is worthwhile, and part of it is purely theoretical and useless, and because you have had some practical experience, you imagine you know it all. Now, you have lots yet to learn, B, and I am willing to help you, but I want to tell you that that plan and those specifications are technically correct, and all you need to do is to go ahead and carry them out. I'll take the responsibility. Very well, said B. If you want those plans and specifications carried out as they are, you can get someone else to do it. I would rather resign than to superintend this job, which I know to be technically wrong. His resignation had to be passed upon by the general manager, who, before accepting it, sent for him. What's the trouble, B? Said he. I thought you were getting along fine. We like your work, and we thought you liked the company. Why do you want to leave? I don't like to say anything about it, Mr. Jones, said B, but the plans passed on to me to carry out in the construction of that new powerhouse down in Elm Street are technically wrong. They mean an expenditure of $35,000 along certain lines, which will be pretty nearly a dead loss. When you come to try to use your equipment there, you will find that it all has to be taken out and replaced by the proper materials. Suppose you get the plans, B, and show them to me, and explain just what you mean, said the general manager, who was also a professional engineer of many years' successful experience. So B produced the plans and explained his proposition. Why, of course you are right, said the general manager. I'm surprised that Mr. F should have thought for a moment that he could use that type. The result was that B was reinstated and the chief engineer reprimanded. Stung by his reprimand and angered because the correspondence school graduate had bested him, the chief engineer resigned. His resignation was accepted and B became chief engineer of the company. Later, he was promoted to the position of chief engineer of an even larger corporation and, finally, occupied an executive position as managing engineer for a municipal light and power plant in one of the large cities of the country. The genesis of an inventor. Some years ago, we spent a few months in a very comfortable and homelike hotel in one of the largest cities in the Middle West. Down in a nook of the basement of this hotel was a private electric light plant. In charge of the plant was an old Scotch engineer delightful for his wise sayings and quaint philosophy. The fireman, a young man named T, was rather a puzzle to us. He had all the marks of unusual mechanical ability, and yet he seemed to take only the slightest interest in his work, and was constantly being reproved by his chief for laziness, irresponsibility, and neglect of duty. "What's the use?" he asked us, after we gained his confidence, and had asked him why he did not take greater interest in his work. "What's the use? After years of experience shoveling coal into a firebox and monkeying around these old grease pots, I suppose I might get an engineer's certificate. Then what would I be? Why, just like old Mac there, $75 to $100 a month, sitting around a hot, close basement 12 hours a day, or perhaps 12 hours at night, nothing to look forward to, no further advancement, no more pay, and, finally, TB would carry me off because of the lack of fresh air, sunshine, and outdoor exercise. No, thank you. Well then, why don't you do something else? I don't know what to do. I like mechanics, and some job of this kind is the only thing I know how to do or would care to do. Yet, I don't care for this. I must confess that I am puzzled as to what in the world I was made for, anyhow. What you need is to give your time and attention to the intellectual side of engineering rather than the purely mechanical and physical. You are of the intellectual type, and you are as badly placed trying to do mere mechanical work as if you were an eagle trying to cross the country on foot. I believe you are right in that. I am going to get an education. Ambition, industry, and persistence. He began at once with correspondence courses in mechanical and electrical engineering. 12 hours a day, he shoveled coal in his basement boiler room. Some 4 to 8 hours a day he studied in his little room up under the roof. It takes an immense amount of courage, persistence, and perseverance to complete a correspondence course in engineering, as anyone who has tried it well knows. There is lacking any inspiration from the personality and skill of a teacher. There is no spur to endeavor from association with other students doing the same kind of work and striving for the same degree. There are no glee clubs, athletic games, fraternities, prizes, scholarships, and other aids to the imagination and ambition, such as are found in a university. It is all hard, lonely work. But what the student learns, he knows. And somehow, he gains a great knack for the practical use of his knowledge. Night after night he toiled away until he had finished his course and secured his certificate of graduation. By this time T.S. ambition began to assume a definite form. He was determined that he should have the honor and the emoluments which would come to him as a result of solving one of the toughest problems in engineering, one which had puzzled both technical and practical men for many years. He therefore saved up a few dollars and, packing his little belongings, departed to complete his education in one of the most famous technical engineering schools of the country. Tuition was high. Board cost a good deal of money. Books were distressingly expensive. Tools, machine shop fees, and other incidentals ate into the little store he had brought with him, and inside of 2 months it was gone. He hunted around and finally secured a job running an engine. This meant 12 hours in the engine room every night. In addition, he did what other students considered a full day's work attending lectures and carrying on his studies in the laboratories and classroom. He went almost without necessary food and clothing in order to buy books, tools, and other equipment. But he was young, he was strong, and, above all, he was happy in his mental picture of the great object of his ambition. In due time, he had taken his degree, having specialized on all subjects bearing upon the solution of his great problem. Patient toil his genius. Coming back from the university after having finished his course, T. found a position as engineer in an electric light and power plant. Then he began saving up money to purchase the necessary equipment for a laboratory of his own. Finally, he had a little building and was one of the proudest young men we ever saw. Little by little, he added to his apparatus the things he needed. Several nights a week, after his hard day's work in the engine room, he toiled, trying to solve the problem upon which he had fixed his mind. About this time he married, and he and his wife moved into a narrow little flat. Years passed, children came into the little flat, and still he worked at his problem. Again and again, and still again, he failed. Yet, each time he failed, he told us he was coming closer to the solution. At last came the day, after many heartbreaking experiences, when the problem, while not fully solved, had at least revealed a solution which was commercially valuable. His years of self-denial and toil seemed to be about to end in success. But he found that he had only begun another long period of discouraging and almost desperate work. It was a struggle to scrape together the necessary funds for securing a patent. If he was to complete and perfect his invention, he must have more capital. So, with his model, he made the rounds of manufacturers of engines, manufacturers who used engines, railroads, steamboat companies, electric light and power companies. In fact, everywhere he thought he might get some encouragement and financial assistance. His little family was living on short rations. He himself had not eaten as he ought for years. One after another, the men in authority said, "Yes, your proposition looks good, but I don't think it can ever be made practical. Some of the brightest men in the engineering profession have spent years trying to solve that problem, and have not found the answer to it. I do not believe that it will ever be found. You seem to have come near it, but yet you have not found it, and we cannot see our way clear to put any money into it." Reaping his reward, T argued, pleaded, and demanded an opportunity for a demonstration, but all in vain. Then, one day, a lawyer, who had been consulted by T, said, "I have no money to invest in anything myself, but I'll tell you frankly and honestly, it looks good to me. Now, I happen to be on very good terms with Mr. J over at the T and B Company. He has been interested in this problem for years, and has worked along toward its solution. He understands every phase of it, and I believe he will do something with your device. Unless I am mistaken, he will be interested in it, and will give you an opportunity to demonstrate it. If your demonstration works out as well as you think it will, he has the authority to put you in a position where you can go ahead and perfect it if it is perfectible. I will give you a letter of introduction to him." And thus began T.S. prosperity. He now lives in a beautiful home on a wide boulevard. His invention, still short of perfection, but highly valuable, is coming slowly into use, and would probably be in very widespread use were it not for the fact that he is constantly working on it, perfecting it, improving it, and hoping finally to have a complete solution to the problem.